Dear ones, today we're giving a short but very powerful gospel lesson. It's timely, I think, the Sunday before Thanksgiving. Eat, drink, and be merry. We'll talk about that in announcements. We see the image in today's gospel of a man who was very concerned for his own physical well-being, but not his spiritual well-being. And part of the sign that he did not care for his spiritual well-being is that he was very concerned with himself, so much so that when he had an abundance, he hatched a plan so that he could have an even greater abundance without thinking of his neighbor whatsoever. It's really a gospel lesson about the dangers of a lack of generosity towards others. We have to ask ourselves, would people look at us and personally describe us as generous? It's a question that every Christian should ask himself. In the early church, the Christians were known especially for their love and their generosity. And in fact, one of the greatest persecutors of the church, Julian the Apostate, I'm not sure if you know much about Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate was originally a Christian early on in his life. After the Christianization of the empire, when paganism was very much in the decline and almost wiped out, Julian the Apostate was a student with a certain famous figure. He was a classmate of St. Gregory of Nazianzus, the theologian. And then along with St. Basil the Great. And St. Gregory prophesied, he said, someday this man will betray the faith. And certainly this is what happened. Julian ascended to become the emperor himself, and he thought that it was his role to re-paganize the empire. So he began to push against Christianity, which had spread everywhere, and to reignite those almost extinct embers of paganism. It didn't go very well, by the way. But in the process of this, Julian tried to defend the re-paganization of the empire by writing a lot against Christianity. And we know mainly from the Christian authors who wrote against him what his arguments were. And interestingly, in all of his criticisms against Christianity, which show that he had a profound misunderstanding of what Christianity was, he never really lived it, despite the fact that he had such an extremely hardened heart against the Christians, even while criticizing them and criticizing Christianity itself as the bane of the empire, he is still quoted as saying that despite all of their errors, despite the Christians' misunderstandings, despite the Christians not really knowing the scriptures, despite everything they've done wrong, despite their ills towards the pagans, at the very least, those Christians sure do excel when it comes to love and generosity. Love and charity excelled in these Christians who he despised so much. So even the pagans recognized that the heart of the Christian was one where love and generosity overflowed so much so that they stood out from the rest of society and all other faiths. Joyful giving is the mark expression of a true Christian. And it ought to be so much so that we too stand out from among our non-Christian populace. It should be the mark of our very existence. Joyful love and giving. St. John Chrysostom, he's very tough on this issue. He goes as far as to say that whatever we have in excess of our necessity rightly belongs to the poor. And if we keep anything in excess of our necessity, we are considered thieves. We have stolen what rightly belongs to them. It's a tough word. It's a very, very tough word. But Christ and his saints give further motivation for giving. They say maybe we don't have that loving spirit and that spirit of generosity for others. So think of yourself and know that when you give to others, when you give to those in need, that giving is returned to you with interest in the heavenly kingdom. This is how we build mansions in heaven. The more we give, the more we build our mansions in heaven. Essentially, all that you give is returned to you with interest in the age to come. And so even if we're going to look at it in a selfish way and think, how is this going to benefit me? This is the way. Whatever I give now is temporal anyway, and probably I'm not going to spend that money on anything good, just more entertainment and comfort, which we don't need any more of. But I'll get it back. I'll get it back in the age to come. Admittedly, charity is a bit more difficult today. On the one hand, we have so many social programs around us that a lot of our giving comes through taxes. And then in those pockets, in those areas where we see that there's still a need, we look out and we see that often when we give, it makes people worse rather than better. We're dealing with a situation that much of the world hasn't had to deal with. Issues of mental illness and drug abuse, addictions. So indeed, we have to be very cautious about that generosity. But I think we make a mistake when we look at generosity and charitable giving, and all we think of are those on the streets. There are those among us who also need aid and need help. There are those among us who are struggling, who are barely able to pay their own rent. So, where can we give? If we aren't giving to those we see on the streets, we can give to churches, we can give to monasteries, and we can give to certain charitable organizations. This church, I'm not sure if you're aware, we have a fund ourselves that's specifically a benevolent fund for when people come to me and they're in great need. You can take your tithing, and whatever you give in excess to that, you can mark specifically for the benevolent fund. We can always use funds in that, by the way. But more than just giving money, we need to learn to give ourselves. What energy, what time, and what talents we have in excess. How we can offer those to others. When we have that extra time, again, rather than giving it over to leisure and comfort and entertainment all the time, we can look at ourselves and we can avoid the foolish man in today's gospel and not say to ourselves, I have everything necessary taken care of myself, now I can eat, drink, and be merry. I can rest and relax, I can play my video games. Instead, we can look around and say, who is in need right now? What time, what talents can I give to those around me? Who could use some aid and some help? I know many of you already give in terms of time. You help clean the church. You help give in other ways. We have a couple shut-ins who I know some of you visit. If you want to partake in that, by the way, come talk to me. But the point is that we ought to see that excess time and those excess talents as not belonging to ourselves, but like St. John Chrysostom says, belonging to those who need them most. We should be involved in these things. If we have time on a weekly basis, we can look to maybe a nursing home that could use volunteers. Or we can look to soup kitchens that can use volunteers. And ultimately, it's necessary that when we give, as I said, we give out of a spirit of love. And that means giving joyfully. If we give bitterly, if we give out of a sense only of obligation, we really lose much of the reward. But if we give joyfully, trying to prove to those around us that the heart of a Christian indeed is different and shines forth with that love, Lord knows we could transform the world around us. So, dear ones, may we, as we enter this week of Thanksgiving, especially consider our own lives and ask, if someone were observing my life from afar, would they see a generous and joyful giver? And we ought to pray especially this week for those who do not have the abundance that we have and seek ways to aid them. May God grant us such joyful and generous hearts. Amen.